All right, welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Dublin to talk with author, blogger, economist David McWilliams. David will soon be hosting Kilkenomics, Ireland's first ever economics festival. Am I pronouncing that correctly, David?
You are absolutely, Max. It's in the medieval town of Kilkenny, which used to be the capital of Ireland many, many years ago. And what we're doing is something quite different, Max. We're actually bringing economists in, both from international, I'll go through the list in a minute, and local economists. And we're bringing stand-up comedians in to discuss. So it's a kind of a Milton Friedman meets kind of Lenny Bruce combination for the weekend of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th November.
All right. Well, some would argue, of course, that Ben Bernanke and his predecessor, Alan Greenspan, were basically comedians dressed up as economists. So these are economists now coming forward with some straight-out comedy. Now, David McWilliams, just talk about the economy for a second. You write on your blog, who will invest in a country, that being Ireland, with an obvious death wish? How and why is Ireland committing nationicide?
Well, what we have at the moment, Max, this morning Irish bond yields went out to almost 100 basis points. They're touching close to 8% now. So in effect, the game is over for the present strategy of the government. The present strategy of the government was to try to convince the markets that a small economy like Ireland, whose banking system is bust, whose consumer is very fragile, whose savings ratio has risen dramatically, will be able to carry enormous and very immediate front-loaded cuts in our budget deficit. And the government tried to convince the markets that we could do all this by front-loading 15 billion of cuts and starting very, very quickly. Now, the markets clearly believe, Max, that it's not possible to do that. And rather than buy the government's announcement last week, they sold the government's announcement. And this again has been compounded by events last Friday, where the European leaders came up with a sort of a stopgap, which is Angela Merkel realizes that the European Stability Pact, the Stability Fund, which is up next year, will have to be reinstituted again, simply because there's many of us here in Europe who believe that it simply amounts to a bailout for German and French banks that lent hastily and, I would say, recklessly to Greek, Irish, Spanish, and Portuguese consumers. Well, in the case of Greece, they lent to the Greek government. So what you have is a sort of a tug of war at the center of Europe, where Angela Merkel needs to protect her banking system. Her banking system is exposed to us. We, on the other hand, are in a situation where a country like Ireland probably needs to go for a very rapid debt renegotiation, simply because at present levels of debt, particularly in the private sector, people will not be able to pay and the economy will be dragged downwards, consumption will fall and demand will fall, unemployment will rise, and we will get a 1980s-style failed fiscal adjustment, the sort of thing you saw in a lot of Latin American countries in the 1980s, where the governments came in, they talked a great game, but they couldn't deliver because the economy contracted and the middle class took their money out of the economy, and you got capital flight at a time when the economy was very, very weak. So you have two or three forces, Max, going on. The upshot, of course, is that ourselves and Portugal this morning look as if we are moving very swiftly towards the Greek position, which is moving directly into the European Stability Fund. You know that Greece has opted to do that and is out of the market for 3 years. The Irish government decided not to go back into the bond market until next March, claiming that we had enough money. But in many ways, that's like a drunken guy leaving the pub late at night and saying, don't worry, the party's not over because I've got 5 or 6 bottles of vodka stashed behind the kitchen sink. The problem is that after those bottles of vodka are drunk, you've got to go back to the market. So we seem to have hit a brick wall where the force of the Irish public's inability to stomach these new cuts and the market's skepticism about what the economy will look like after the cuts is forcing people to drop Irish bonds.
Now, David McWilliams, the key component here is a bunch of Irish real estate developers made a multi-billion-dollar gamble that failed, blew up in their face, and they got the government to impose austerity measures on the population to clean up their mess. So the Irish public is not responsible for these debts, for this austerity that's being forced down their throat. The Irish public has no responsibility for debts that were fraudulently induced. Why should the Irish public pay a penny of this debt?
Well, this is what I've been arguing for quite a long time, is that we introduced a guarantee 2 years ago, which I think was the right thing to do in order to find out just how bad certain banks were, and then use the clock that was ticking as the guarantee began to run out to call the creditors into a room with a very nasty liquidator, take away the key, and say, don't come out of this room until you've done a deal. And the liquidator should have said exactly to the creditors who lent to the Irish property speculators, there is no money, and even if there was money, we wouldn't be minded to give it to you because it's not our problem, it's your problem. You lent to the banks, they lent to the developers. Your average Irish person, although many, many hundreds or thousands got involved in this game, your average Irish person was small fry and is already suffering negative equity from their rather rash decisions in the last 5 years. So the big money is the developers, as you point out. The big liability and the big concern is the foreign creditors who lent to the banks. Now, ultimately, I believe that capitalism should see its course, and simply, if you lent to the Irish banks, whether as a bondholder or as a stockholder, you pay. And then your crisis is over, Max.
Now, I was in Dublin a few months ago and reading a lot of the business publications in Ireland, and they're trying to make the case that the Irish public is to blame for taking on these debts. And yet we know from studying the way that the real estate markets were financed and engineered around the world, particularly in the U.S. during this foreclosure crisis, which is part and parcel of the global foreclosure crisis and the global misrepresentation in terms of packaging mortgage-backed securities into fraudulent securities. The public has been victimized here. And what recourse does the public have? Now, you're putting on the festival in that beautiful town of Kilkenny, I believe, to try to gather attention to this. But the Irish press, by and large, is obviously siding with the developers and the people who fraudulently peddled fraudulent mortgages and are dealing in fraudulent securities. Why is the Irish press? Is it just too cozy with the establishment?
Well, I suppose if you look, you've got to look at the big picture here. The Irish press, in the main, cheer-led the boom. Those of us who were very skeptical about the boom and were warning about the boom were largely dismissed as cranks and people who didn't really understand the new dynamic. I mean, if you look back to 1929, you have the same sort of carry on again. What you have is, if you look back just before the crash, you had all sorts of journalists and economists and leading academics saying there's a new era and productivity has changed and there's new technology and this time it's different and ultimately prices are at a sustainable level. Now, all those guys who came up with that flannel during the Irish boom are the very same guys who are today telling the Irish people that we have to pay for the mistakes of the developers that those cheerleaders emboldened in the first place. So what you have is simply a very cozy cartel in a very small country. What we have really is that Ireland looks more like a rapidly developing country, like one of the Asian tigers that we saw in the 1990s. And what we saw in the Asian tigers, you take the position of something like Thailand, you get a small oligarchy which is very close to the political class. They get laws changed for them to enable their own speculation to be incredibly profitable. Ultimately, they borrow a huge amount from banks that they can count on. They invest enormously in local, in the case of Thailand, it was actually local property as well. And then when things go belly up, they expect the people to bail them out. So, I mean, the story of the Wall Street crash, the story of the Asian crash, these are all broadly similar. And what makes Ireland more unique is the sense that the country is small. So the power of a tiny minority to really affect what I would regard as, and I said it many years ago, a financial coup d'etat is actually rather real.
David McWilliams, I understand the comparison to an Asian country and some of the other financial crises around the world, but in Ireland, they just spent decades fighting an Irish independent movement only to be now colonized by Anglo-Irish Bank. Where's all the fire? Where's all the revolutionary, where's the Bobby Sands of this movement?
Well, what is interesting, Max, is that the Greeks and the Portuguese, and particularly the French, who've been rioting in the last couple of months, are looking at the Irish and saying, why the hell are you guys taking what is a much deeper adjustment, much deeper cuts. Why are you taking this all lying down? And it strikes me that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg yet. And I believe politically it's very, very difficult for this government to stay in power. They're very, very unpopular. They only have 18% of the popular vote. That's the main political party, Fianna Fáil. I think most Irish people believe there will be an election in the next 12 months. And preceding that election, I suspect what we will see is much more active protest from the Irish people, the sort of thing we haven't seen for the last 2 years.
Well, let's talk about the festival that you're putting together in Kilkenny. It's called Kill Economics. It's an economics festival. You've got some pretty high-profile guests coming to the festival. You've got comedians, and I guess as you mentioned before, to try to educate the public, if you can use popular comics and entertainment and theater, at least to get people up to speed on why they should be angry. Forget about the fact that they're not angry yet, but at least trying to get them to understand why they should be.
Well, Max, the issue is very simple. Economics is far too important to be left to academics and public servants. Economics is us. It's our lives. It's our money. It's our careers. It's everybody's family. And ultimately, I think if you take brilliant international economists like Peter Schiff is one of our keynote speakers, and Peter's around for the whole weekend, and he'll be known very well to watchers of the Keiser report and investors in America. And Peter, rather than having Peter discuss with other economists, I'm going to have Peter discuss with one of our best stand-up comedians, a guy called Des Bishop, who's originally an Irish-American from Brooklyn. And what Des is going to be doing is he kind of gives the rest of the audience the permission to ask Peter questions that might not necessarily be so easy if you've never gone to an economics festival before, but you've gone to a stand-up gig before. So in a way, what the stand-ups are doing is they're asking the questions that the average guy in the street wants to know. So we have like Peter Schiff, we have Bill Black, who's you know very well in the United States. Bill Black wrote a fantastic book called The Easiest Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And I think that succinctly describes what has happened here in this country. We also have from Iceland, we have the most famous Icelandic commentator. He's going to come over here, and Vili's going to explain what happened in Iceland. We have commentators from Israel. We also have the last finance minister of Argentina, Martin Listau. And I think for a lot of people in Ireland, and not only in Ireland, but the rest of peripheral Europe, the experience of Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil is very, very instructive. So Martin is going to come over and explain what happened in Argentina in the last 10 years, particularly because they faced the same debt dynamics as we did. And together it's going to be good fun, good economics, good comedy, and it's a great city to spend a weekend in. So it's called Kilkenomics from Thursday the 11th of November to Sunday the 14th. So the website is www.kilkenomics.com. We hope to see you there.
Fantastic. David McWilliams, thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Cheers, Max. Take care.
All right.